Cross Duel officially released on September 6th, 2022, with a limited beta for 2 months prior in Canada, Hong Kong, and the Netherlands. No cards were added between beta and release, meaning players had 1 to 3 months before the first major update promised to add new cards and change skills. The game introduced a new way to play Yu-Gi-Oh! A 4-player free-for-all with simultaneous turns, taking a major departure from the card game we know. There was no extra deck, and all monsters start out as vanillas. Fusion, Synchro, Ixies, and Link monsters all found their way into your main deck and weren't recognized as their original summoning type unless you used in-game resources to unlock their special skills, exclusive abilities given to SR and UR monsters. For example, the Blue Eyes White Dragon could destroy any one monster when it came onto the field, and Stardust Dragon continuously revived level 3 or lower monsters. The game launched with 195 cards, but not all were available to players. A few NPC-specific cards were relegated to raid bosses in a PvE co-op mode, while another 4 took inspiration from Yu-Gi-Oh! Arc 5's action cards. At the start of each ranked match, a bonus card would appear in the middle of the duel field, and the player to get there first claimed the powerful spell or trap as their prize. From the remaining 169 cards available to players, users would select 20 to make up their deck. Cross Duel used the Highlander format, meaning decks have no duplicate cards, except for the cheating NPCs. One monster was designated as the Ace, meaning it always appeared in the starting hand and could use 3 skills, while all other monsters were limited to 1. To unlock additional skill slots, you would need multiple copies of the card, obtained by heading to the Gacha, where 1200 gems netted you 10 traps, spells, and monsters at random. Other cards of the same rarity could be traded at a 4-to-1 ratio if you didn't draw what you need. With only 1 copy of each card allowed in the deck, the game released with no forbidden and limited list. During the early meta, the best cards revolved heavily around those with the highest stats. Not only were they the most likely to win against opponents' monsters, but the lack of unique effects on low rarity monsters meant that anything but those with the best attack or defense were unviable. There was no point in running Karibo when Giant Soldier of Stone and Go 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 Golem got the same skills. It's also worth mentioning that Cross Duel's combat works differently. After each battle, the surviving monster would lose attack or defense equal to the opponent's stat, based on each card's position. This means Giant Soldier of Stone could beat a 1900 attack monster, go down to 100 defense, and then advance towards an opponent with its full 1300 attack. Additionally, due to the simultaneous turns, cards that changed battle position or swapped attack and defense values were much better than they were in the regular card game. Some players went as far as to not include Mad Archfiend in their deck, as 0 defense made it a liability against Shield and Sword or monsters with the Intimidate skill. That said, the game still favored aggression overall. This boils down to the following factors. First, players don't immediately take life point damage when their monsters get destroyed. A monster must spend 2 turns in attack position, moving across the battlefield before they reach an opponent and can attack directly. Secondly, trying to hold yourself up was too slow on tempo. You couldn't summon additional monsters to lanes that you were defending, and if you were unlucky, your opponent would back up their own push with Blue Eyes White Dragon, instantly destroying your defender and leaving you wide open for a direct attack. By putting your monsters in attack mode, they met the opponent halfway down the lane, meaning any enemy monsters posing an imminent threat to your life points were already severely weakened. Lastly, monsters that fought and survived battles became ideal fodder for your high-level monsters. Why tribute 2 healthy monsters for your Blue Eyes White Dragon, when you could instead tribute 2 monsters that have each already won a fight and are left at 500 or less attack? All of this comes together to explain why stats are so important on low rarity monsters, but what about high rarity ones, which had unique skills no other monster in the game could duplicate? Unfortunately, the monsters with the best stats also happen to be the ones with the best effects. Blue Eyes White Dragon and Red Dragon Archfiend tied for highest attack in the game. They were also the only 2 ultra rare monsters with destruction effects. It comes as no surprise that these were in turn the highest ranked UR monsters on early tier lists. What may be surprising though, is that the best monster in the game wasn't a UR. Z-Metal Tank is an unassuming monster in regular Yu-Gi-Oh! And flew under the radar for the first few weeks of the Cross Duel beta. However, players like Udrop and Neospatian Sarah experimented with making various non-UR monsters their ace, before settling on Z-Metal Tank as the best option. It is one of 3 monsters with access to a specific skill combination, 2 copies of Cohesion, and immunity to destruction. And despite having the best stats of the 3, Z-Metal Tank was only a rare, while the other 2 were both super rares. This made the deck affordable for most players. The deck strategy is aggro in its simplest form. Play as many monsters as possible, and by turn 2, your Z-Metal Tank will have upwards of 3500 attack, offering even better stats than Blue Eyes without having to tribute any monsters. By the time the game officially released and entered Season 1, Z-Metal Tank had made a name for itself as the best monster, its only weakness being that if the initial push failed, it would run out of steam by turn 3 or 4 and be open to a counterattack. For those that preferred gameplay focused on card value, Gagaga Magician offered a solution. Gagaga Magician's reincarnation skill allowed it to return to the hand every time it got destroyed, at the cost of negating all of its skills. But Gagaga Magician could use its second skill slot to gain immunity to that very own negation. This monster has a modest stat line, but when taking into account that it could be summoned 4 or more times in a single game, the stat total exceeded anything else possible from a single card, even without taking into account Gagaga Magician's third skill, Attack Support. This granted all other monsters you control 200 attack when summoned, and players summoned Gagaga Magician a lot. Z-Metal Tank buffs itself, and Gagaga Magician buffs everything else, leading to some players calling it the reverse Z-Metal Tank. The name was quite warranted. If we compare a Gagaga Magician deck with a Z-Metal Tank deck, we find that they share more cards than they have different. Every remaining card from the Z-Metal Tank deck is either SR or UR, meaning it was entirely possible that players just didn't own the cards or would be running them. This is particularly highlighted by the inclusion of Junk Synchron over Soprano the Melodious Songstress, a monster with the same skill but better stats. This wouldn't be the first time the Yu-Gi-Oh franchise had a problem with limited access to powerful high-rarity cards, but that's a story for another video. The game launched to a dedicated fanbase, but little fanfare. The marketing team provided basically no promotion, and the odd duel format failed to draw a huge crowd. Despite being a brand new game, it wasn't uncommon to find 0 players streaming. Additionally, the entirety of Season 1 saw no in-game events, leaving players with little to do but grind the ranked ladder. In fact, the player base was small enough that Konami pushed an update halfway through Season 1 which broadened the matchmaking. Now, rather than fighting AI duelists, players in Platinum got pared down and fought against those still in Gold. With a relatively well-defined meta and little to do, some players looked for tournaments, but there weren't many to be found. One player trying to get things off the ground was Kamel from DLE, a Twitch and YouTube group which originally formed around Duel Links content. A few 8 and 16 player tournaments were hosted during live streams, with Z-Metal Tank making repeated dominating performances. The first tournament to surpass a $5 prize pool was September 28, 2022, with a $50 prize pool sponsored by GG Tour, an esports company that has worked with DLE for both Duel Links and Master Duel. At the start of the tournament, 22 of the 32 signups showed up to battle for the crown, and as expected, decks featuring Z-Metal Tank, Gagaga Magician, and Blue Eyes White Dragon all made it to the top 4. While these proved the most popular throughout the event, various other ace monsters joined the fray, including Red Dragon Artrine, Gaia the Fierce Knight, and Trickstar Holly Angel. This diversity was spurred in part by one of the tournament's rules, no deck lists. Players were capable of swapping cards in and out between every game with no limitations. Some players used this to side in defensive options like Trap Hole to deal with certain decks, while others used the opportunity to bring multiple decks to the event, keeping opponents on their toes and playing around cards that might be sided against them. The biggest surprise from this event was second place finisher Monkey Got Crit's Stardust Pendulum deck, making use of a reincarnation strategy reminiscent of Gagaga Magician. Despite the strong showing and a group of vocal supporters, players largely wrote off this success as a fluke, finding it hard to believe a deck with 3 level 8 monsters and 7 traps could avoid bricking. During a discussion about whether to keep the deck rules the same during any future events, Monkey defends the deck by pointing out it was specialized specifically to take advantage of high-level gameplay. Unfortunately, no further events were announced before the end of the season. This left the true strength of Stardust Dragon and many other ace monsters up in the air. When voting on the tier list, many of the respondents indicated that they didn't own or basically never saw players using a majority of the decks. While dedicated players and theory crafters existed for most cards, the game's paywalls made certain decks nearly unplayable. When you're using an aggro deck like Z-Metal Tank and don't own every 1800 attack monster in the game, you can substitute a 1700 attack monster and get mostly the same result. But with a deck like Trickstar Holly Angel or Gaia the Fierce Knight, you need multiple SR cards before the basic strategy begins to function. With Monster Mash decks rampant on the ladder, one might be wondering about spell and trap cards. The question was simple: would I rather draw this instead of a vanilla monster? And overwhelmingly, the answer was no. Monsters can be used to defend, initiate pushes, follow up on attacks, or be used as material for larger monsters, no questions asked. Simply by existing, they offer versatility, meaning spells and traps need to have strong effects to make up for it. Under this system, Shield and Sword stood head and shoulders above the rest of the spells in the game. It can boost a weakened Blue Eyes back up to 2500 attack. It can swap an opponent's Firewall Dragon down to 0. You can even use this in lanes you aren't involved in to extend the game or finish off a player. Many decks would run Shield and Sword as the sole spell. Among the traps, none were as respected as Wall of Disruption. Despite the awkward English wording indicating the lane ahead, singular, this trap card countered monsters from all lanes. If all 3 opponents sent a monster towards you, all 3 of those monsters lost 1500 attack. No other card in the game was as helpful for recovering from a 1v3 situation. With the prevalence of aggro strategies, it wasn't uncommon for a Wall of Disruption to be hitting 5 or even 6 monsters at once. However, unlike Shield and Sword, Wall of Disruption was a hard to find SR, meaning most players simply did not own the card. Apart from this golden duo, a few other spells were commonly seen. The position changing cards, Enemy Controller, Block Attack, and Stop Defense all saw moderate success. Enemy Controller was considered the best of the 3, exchanging the ability to target your own monster to swap an opponent's regardless of position. Block Attack could slow down a push or create a favorable trade, as most popular monsters had significantly higher attack than defense. Conversely, Stop Defense saw play in aggro decks to force defensive monsters into attack mode, though some players ran cards that grant monsters Pierce instead. During the beta, Mask of Brutality had a strong reputation for offering the largest attack increase, but it fell off after the official release with the rise of Shield and Sword in decks. Poisonous Winds was an alternative option to Wall of Disruption for mid-range decks, trading the ability to work against multiple lanes for the ability to push back without ever leaving yourself open for a direct attack. Rush Recklessly and Super Rush Headlong saw some play as a way to help push for the bonus card, and were also staples of various OTK strategies. Most other spells only saw play in dedicated decks, such as Time Gazer Magician, an OTK strategy that abused Opti Camouflage Armor and a variety of buff spells to hit for 4000 damage with stealth. Among the remaining traps, the most common card was Shield Handler, which allowed players to operate without fear of Blue Eyes White Dragon or Mirror Force. However, opinion remains split on whether using one of your 20 card slots for an effect that may never trigger was actually worth it. After all, not every lobby would have a Blue Eyes player, and even when they do, that player is going to be targeting someone else 2 out of 3 times. Tempo decks made use of Compulsory Escape Device and Compulsory Evacuation Device. These cards worked well on the center lane during turn 1 to secure the bonus card, but possibly worked even better on the side lanes, being used to guarantee your initial push goes uncontested. Curse of Anubis had similar use, but was largely inaccessible due to its high rarity. Battle Mania was an alternative to Stop Defense and Enemy Controller. By granting Provoke, you'd theoretically be able to use the effect multiple times. However, this came at a significant amount of versatility, and the card was easily considered the worst of the 3. Trap Hole saw play as a niche tech option against Elemental Hero Neos and Z-Metal Tank. However, the card doesn't remove the opponent's monster from the field, so players running it limited their options for counterattacks. Lastly, Dark Revelation saw some experimentation as a second copy of Wall of Disruption. A few players ran an Inventor sub-engine, attempting to reach the 4 triggers required for the trap. The requirement proved too much for most, however, as it required handicapping your deck for a card that you may never actually draw.
I kept this secretly in store for this special moment. I summon Raiza, the Storm Monarch!
When players got tired of PvP, they could try out the previously mentioned co-op PvE raid mode for additional gems, skill materials, and even a profile icon. Season 1 featured Raiza the Storm Monarch, serving as a tutorial for the various mechanics of raids. Raid mode comes with its own set of 6 exclusive raid spells, which each grant monsters an associated raid exclusive skill. Deck building in raids was also altered by the victory condition. Rather than breaking through a duelist's defenses and dealing 4k damage, Raiza the Storm Monarch could have as much as 95,000 attack. Sustained damage was paramount to defeating the boss before the 8-turn limit ran out, catapulting elemental hero Neos to stardom. With just 1 skill slot attached, elemental hero Neos infinitely returned to its owner's hand as a 1 tribute monster with 1500 attack. This sounds terrible, but a special raid mechanic granted high-level monsters free skills that would boost their attack by 1000. This now meant Neos players could turn any monster in their deck into a 2500 Beatstick. If players happened to have additional skill slots unlocked, they could also use Neos' special raid exclusive skill, which granted another 2000 attack. Stardust Dragon also saw some play in high-level raids. Much like Neos, Stardust Dragon could come back every time it was destroyed, and Stardust's raid skill was arguably better, granting 1000 to all allied monsters. However, this required a minimum of 3 skill slots, and unlike Neos, Stardust would always need 2 tributes to be summoned, making the deck much more awkward to run and pick up lobbies. The last game mode accompanying the launch was Tag Duel, a 2v2 format where you and a teammate share 4,000 life points. However, this mode was a complete disappointment on launch, largely because tag duels were unable to be played with other humans, even in casual, unranked matches. Let me repeat that. The 2v2 mode was locked to single-player content. Furthermore, despite only having 3 levels of AI to fight against, players would need to win 100 times to finish their missions, and even that left you far away from completing the cumulative rewards track featured for each world. Season 2 promised to introduce new cards, balance old ones, and provide new content in the form of event duels. Find out if it lived up to the hype next time on The History of Cross Duel.